Hey everyone, welcome to this 90 Days of DevOps 2024 edition, organized by Michael Cade and the awesome DevOps community. In today's world, integrating your DevOps workflows is a crucial step in your software delivery process. Now, thankfully, Azure DevOps and GitHub, the two Microsoft DevOps solutions that I'll talk about, offer seamless integrations, which can help you streamlining your workflows and obviously simplifying your overall DevOps and development process. In this presentation, we'll explore some of the key benefits using Azure DevOps and GitHub, but not as a standalone product, but really bringing those two together. And I'll walk you through quite some demos how you can actually bring those two worlds together. My name is Peter Detender. I'm an Azure technical trainer at Microsoft Redmond. Feel free to stay in touch by email petender@microsoft.com or connect on Twitter. Now, in today's world, it's all about integrations. We have so many different solutions to choose from, and why not bringing them together? And that's really what my session is about. Now, I'll wrap it up around 4 different domains of integration. The first one is simplifying your workflows, technically using Azure DevOps boards together with GitHub repos. Next, I'll continue working with more repos, but showing you how to streamline managing those repos across the 2 different platforms. In the third topic, I'll showcase you how Azure DevOps pipelines can be integrated with GitHub repos as your source control solution, as well as how you can use GitHub Actions, the pipeline engine on the GitHub platform, to actually trigger your existing Azure DevOps pipelines. And then finally, I'm going to close the session with positioning GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. My name is Peter Detender, as you already heard from the quick introduction, but let me share a little bit more about myself. I'm currently working in Seattle area, directly from the Microsoft Redmond environment, but originally from Belgium, where I relocated about 2 years ago for the role as Microsoft technical trainer, which I think is one of the easiest, most clear job roles within Microsoft because it means I'm providing Azure technical workshops, technical training to our top customers every single week, somewhere across the globe, because it's all virtual. I've been around the IT business for 27 years, and I started as a technical engineer, literally building physical data centers, where over the years I moved up to become a Microsoft consultant, been running my own company for about 10 years, before I moved into the Microsoft trainer role, initially out of Belgium and the EMEA team in summer 2019. Out of those training workshops, my focus has actually shifted completely away from infrastructure, where I'm typically providing Azure Architect workshops, mapping with AZ305 content, AZ204 developing Azure solutions, AZ400, Azure DevOps or Microsoft DevOps Solutions in meantime, and there's a little bit of Azure AI integration using our AI 102 training material as well. Before I moved into the Microsoft role, I was an MVP for 5 years, initially as Windows, and then from there moved on to the Azure stack. As you can see, I've been still giving back to the community, partly by delivering this session, but also did that before, where I published some books, and every now and then I'm still involved in technical reviewing, trying to keep up some technical blogging as well. Now, it's not about me, but it's all about integrating. So I gave you 4 main topics, where the first one is simplifying your workflow, where I picked out 2 scenarios, Azure Boards integration using GitHub repos, as well as showing you an Azure Boards status badge in your repository on the GitHub side. Now, when you think about Azure Boards integration with GitHub, it might be interesting to know what Azure Boards is actually about. Now, Azure Boards allows you to track your work items, think of issues, tasks, epics, user stories, and the like, depending on the project methodology you want to use. Project methodology here means Scrum or Agile, or why not Basic if you don't need all the fancy tools from any of the other 2. Now, from there, you're going to rely on Kanban boards for the representation of your sprints and iterations, which is going to give you a view on, for example, backlogs, what is my team working on, and obviously you can all customize. This. So to give you like a immediate scenario here, so let's imagine a common scenario, I think, where your DevOps team is using Azure Boards for the project management, meaning they rely on the work items, the Kanban boards, everything I talked about already. And from here, you rely on that integration or maybe a migration where your source control is active in GitHub repositories today. Now, one, I would say, really nice solution here is using Azure Boards on one end, directly integrating within GitHub repositories, where you have branch commits, you have pull request commits, and we're going to provide what we call a deep link. So let me show you in this first demo what it's all about. So let me move to my Azure Boards environment. So I got my sample project here called eShop on Web GitHub repo. Why? Because I got multiple eShop on Webs where I'm moving into Azure Boards. Within Azure Boards, I have a few work items and I can create new ones where my project is based on the Scrum methodology, which gives me bugs, epics, features, and a whole bunch of other ones, not too important for the part of my demo. Let's create a new issue here where I'm going to provide a title like Peter is doing a live demo. Although that's probably, hopefully not really an issue, but I just want to show you that this is all live. Live demo of work items in ADO boards. There we go. And I'm going to save this. Now what's important here is my work item ID. Now there's no real integration for each and every Azure DevOps project, but it's just following a sequence number, which means if I would switch to another project, I got a eShop on Web that I'm using for some other scenarios. I go into boards work item, creating a new one. Let's call this an epic. Demo of new epic. I'm just going to save it. Well, now you can see that this is using number 737. So it's just following the sequence, but it's an Azure DevOps sequence number for organizational level. It's not specifically for the project. Cool. Let me first switch back to my sample project I'm going to use for some other demos. Now let's switch to our GitHub environment where I do have an eShop on Web GitHub repo. It's just the name that's identical for me to know within my close to 100 repos to actually know which one I'm using for this recording. So I'm going to go into my code and I'm going to make a small change in my source code. I'm going to update my web page, right? And we're just going to add something, let's say over here. I'm not going to break my code. I'm just going to add a comment. So I'm going to edit my file. I would say preferably you're going to do this from within like a editor, Visual Studio, VS Code, Eclipse, IntelliJ, whatever preference of editor you have. Peter made a change. Now important here is when I'm committing my message, let me make this a little bit larger. When I'm committing my message, that's where the integration comes in. So what I'm going to do here is replacing, and I'm going to add hashtag AB for Azure Boards with the number of my work item. For example, 730, which I think was the one we created. And I'm still going to provide my comment. So this is Peter added a comment, but that's what a commit message is already for. What are we doing? Added live demo scenario. There we go. I'm going to commit my changes in GitHub repositories. Everything's getting accepted. And what it's going to do here in my 730 work item over here, it now has a link to my GitHub scenario. So that's how you can bring those two worlds together. Now you can also see here that you could use some other descriptions like fixes means that it's actually moving your work items on the Azure DevOps side also into the correct status, which means if I go to my Kanban board here, you can see that we have like a doing 733. So let me try and make another change here. Peter, oops, read only, that's not gonna help. Edit. Let's try that again. My web application, app settings, edit. And just adding something new here. I'm going to call this the Peter, and I'm going to call this demo. Committing the changes, where now we do fixes hashtag AB733 problem solved. We're again committing the changes. We're going to switch back. I'm going to refresh my page. And my 733 is now also having that link to my pull request. Or obviously any other scenario that you bring forward. So in short, what did we do here is bringing those two worlds together using Azure Boards, our project management, and using source code, source control updates in GitHub. Now, what's the magic behind the scenes? It's actually on the GitHub side where we need to install a little app. So on our organizational level, we dive on repos level, I should say. We go into settings, and then down here, we have GitHub apps. And what I did is installing GitHub applications, where I selected Azure Boards. We're now in the config. It's going to provide you some explanations. By the way, you need to create a personal access token or enabling OAuth authentication between the two platforms. And you can specify the specific projects for which you want to use that integration. So it's not like it's active on all repositories in GitHub together with all Azure Boards projects. It's literally a one-on-one relationship. Cool. So that I showed you an integration Azure Boards using GitHub repos and creating that deep link. Another scenario here, it's still using the same logic where we still have Azure Boards and using work items, using Kanban boards to representation. Source control is still in GitHub repositories, but now I want to inform my team, which are mainly relying on GitHub repos, about GitHub issues. What we're doing is gradually moving, maybe migrating away from Azure Boards, but not everything at once. So we're going to create a GitHub issue where in the backend, it's still going to create a work item in Azure DevOps. So that's going to be my next demo. So we're starting on the GitHub side. Oh, that's not GitHub either. Over here, that's GitHub. There we go. And within our repo, I created a new GitHub action, which is the pipeline engine on the GitHub side. I didn't really, I would say, created this myself from scratch, because what we're doing here is relying on an existing item from the marketplace. So there is an item available called GitHub Actions Issue to Work item, created by Dan Hallam. Now, what we're doing here, let me zoom in a little bit, is whenever there is a trigger for a new issue, where it can be any status, it can have any update type, or whenever we update, create, or comment on an already existing issue, so it's creating a new one or updating an existing one, we're going to generate an alert, where the alert is now looking for some details in my GitHub information backend and connecting to Azure DevOps. So what we need is a personal access token. So we're going to create a new token in Azure DevOps. Since this is only interacting with work items, I would recommend you to provide limited permissions to only interact with work items, not doing anything else in Azure DevOps. So following the zero trust concept, you could say. Specifying the name of your your Azure DevOps organization, the name of the project, and if you want within Azure Boards, sprints and iterations, you can specify areas and iterations, which in my example, I don't have. And next to that, I'm creating a work item called user story, that's the type, and it has a status new. So let's give this a try. I go into my repo, I create a new issue where we're going to say Peter is creating a new issue in GitHub. There we go. Description, this is a fun session. There we go. I'm going to submit my new issue. From here, I can switch to actions and I can see that my action is already getting triggered. There's not too much visible in the logging besides it's creating an alert. It's going to pick up that task from the marketplace and it's already done. So nothing too fancy, nothing specific. But now let us switch back to our DevOps environment where I'm going to open up my work items. And we have a new work item over here. So the work item is Peter created a new issue. When I open this up in the details, it's providing me a description, what happened here, and what is the backend. It's again providing that deep link because from here I can right click open and it's immediately sending me to my GitHub repo. So that's again bringing those two worlds together. And I already showed you that demo, right? Cool. We're almost done with this first part, but there is another scenario I have in mind. The scenario this time is, again, pretty common, I guess, still gluing the two worlds together. Now we're going to use Azure Boards badging. So Azure Boards provides you a project status badge that you would typically integrate in Azure DevOps repos where your source control is. But now this time your source control is in GitHub. Nothing blocks us from reusing our Azure Boards project status badge and pasting that link into our GitHub repo. And you can imagine I'm going to show you how that works. So we start with our DevOps environment. We go into Azure Boards. And within our Kanban board view that I'm showing here, we go into settings. A little bit hidden if you ask me, but once you know where to find it, it actually makes sense. So we have boards, we have status badge, and what it's providing here is technically nothing really more than a link in sample markdown or even an image URL straight away. Now, depending a bit on your scenario, you can allow anonymous users to use that badge. If imagine your project in GitHub is a public one, I think it makes sense. If it's a private one, then obviously you don't need to enable anonymous access. So what we're going to do is copying this sample markdown link. I'm going to switch to my project. I already have it here. And on the README, or technically I would say anywhere where you want to provide that badge, we're going to paste this in. So what I did here is going into my page and literally pasting in the link to my project and the full URL coming in from Azure Boards. The outcome, as you can see, is if I now open up my README, it's going to show me Azure Boards doing one. Now the doing one actually comes from my DevOps environment, where in my Kanban view, we still have our 733 as doing. So what I can do here is grabbing another one, and now I got two in a doing state, which means if I switch back, if I switch back and I'm going to refresh, you can see that it's now immediately picking up doing two. You can add more status information. So this is just reading out the doing, but you can do the same for the to-do tasks, like the open tasks not assigned yet, and obviously for the ones that are completed as well. If you click on that little image and you do have the correct permissions, right, it's going to send you back to that Kanban board as well. Again, nicely, perfectly integrating those two worlds with each other. Cool. This was Azure Boards and GitHub repos. But the other option here is, what about streamlining my repos? Meaning, we discussed the benefits of integrating GitHub and Azure Boards, but now this time we have source control in GitHub, source control in Azure DevOps, and how we can bring those two worlds together. So the scenario is your team has been using Azure DevOps repos. Maybe they started a long time ago with Team Foundation Server, And they're gradually migrating, maybe thinking about integrating with GitHub repositories, moving towards a single standard, which I think is always a benefit. Easy said, the solution here is nothing more than importing source code into a new GitHub repository. Now, the magic behind the scenes, I would say, is nothing specific. You don't have to install anything. It's mainly based on the fact that we're using Git as the source control management solution or the source control system in both platforms. If you have a Team Foundation server, like the legacy version, the outdated, older version of Azure DevOps, or the version before Azure DevOps, I'm not even sure if I should call it legacy because I think support is actually still live, but I would need to check on that. But there are specific steps required to bring those two worlds together, because Team Foundation source control, Team Foundation version control, as we call it, is using a slightly different format than what Git is doing. So my scenario here is just relying on Git in platform 1, Git in platform 2. And as you can imagine, I got another demo on that. So let's start with, once more, our DevOps environment. I got my eShop on web GitHub repo as the name, and I got my source code in here. I'm going to clone this where it's providing me a link. Way cool. I'm going to copy this link. I switch back to my GitHub environment, and I'm going to create a new repo. I go into repositories, new. I'm going to call this the PE tender live import ADO demo, so I remember later on I can clean this up. It's all public or private, nothing's really changing. Integrating Azure pipelines, Azure boards, I talked about it before, so I guess it makes total sense to enable that. And I'm going to create my new repo. Now from here, I'm not creating a new one, but I'm going to import code. Once I select import code, it's going to ask me, what is your old repositories clone? I don't like that description, but I didn't build it. But I think it should say, what is your current repository? But that's details. Old just seems like a little bit of legacy. And as I mentioned, there are some notes, some remarks about the integration with Team Foundation version control. So I pasted in my link that I created out of the cloning step in Azure DevOps, and I'm going to begin my import. This is going to run for a couple of seconds, couple of minutes, but obviously depending on the size of the repo, it might take a little bit of time. Now, as you can see here, it's switching from different status updates, importing commits. Pretty cool, because now it means that if I open up my project and I go into commits, that now the history I had from commits in Azure DevOps is now still visible here. So I didn't commit anything on the GitHub side. It's literally recognizing the history. But again, it's not really about a fancy integration. It's more because it's all backed by Git source control overall. Where now from here, I could enable the same as what we talked about before. Still using work items, where now we moved our GitHub source code into GitHub. And then maybe depending on the scenario, if your Azure DevOps project already has Azure pipelines. Oh, let me take one step back. So since I used this project already in Azure DevOps, and I do have an Azure pipelines, which is technically the YAML setup of my Azure DevOps pipeline, you could now go like, well, to play safe, we're going to delete this, because obviously Azure pipelines will only work in Azure DevOps. They won't have any use in GitHub. But if you got the two worlds still nicely working together side by side, it might be good to actually keep that. But that's just like the after cleanup, you could say. Cool, cool. Moving on, we're about halfway in. So the next step is triggering my Azure DevOps pipelines, where now the source code is already moved into GitHub. So we're not changing the pipelines yet, but we're only changing the backend, like, hey, pipeline, instead of you picking up the repo in Azure DevOps, I want you to communicate with the repo in GitHub. Now, the thing here is that I would say it's a seamless integration. You have Azure pipelines. You've been using Azure pipelines connecting to Azure DevOps repos because it's all within the same platform. So basically what you need to do, and I'll show you, is just picking another source control option. Even Jenkins would be there and some other Git compatible scenario. So it's not just about Azure pipelines and GitHub. There are a few other options. Now, once you have that, what makes it seamless? First of all, it's integrating the two worlds, which is the main topic that I'm talking about. Next to that, it allows you to still automate builds and deployments, scheduling them, triggering them whenever you have a code change. So easy said, nothing's really changing besides pointing to another GitHub repository, shifting from Azure DevOps repos into GitHub repos. So with that, let's once more switch back to our environments. So my starting point here is my Azure DevOps, where I do have my repos and I do have my pipelines. I can create now a new pipeline where before I would select Azure repos. Where now this time I'm going to highlight that I want to use GitHub. And again, as you can see, there are a few other source control systems supported, and technically you don't really have to change anything. Now, before this is going to work, you need to go into project settings and enabling GitHub connections. So what you need to do here is creating some accounts on either side and exchanging some credentials, which I guess makes total sense. So let's go back into pipelines, new pipeline. It's in GitHub, where now, thanks to the authentication, it's going to ask me which repo I want to use. It's going to read out all my projects, where you already know the sample project here is the PE Tender eShop on Web GH repo. If you've been using Azure DevOps to create YAML pipelines, from here everything should be pretty straightforward, because in the end we're not doing anything different. So I could use an existing pipeline, similar as what I did before. Since I already have one, we're gonna pick CI, there we go, and we're gonna continue. I'm not gonna walk you through all the steps in this pipeline because it's not that relevant for my demo, because most important, what I wanted to show you is we're inside Azure DevOps pipelines over here, and our source control is coming from GitHub. Pretty cool, pretty powerful, and again, another example of a nice integration. Moving on, we have another pretty cool scenario here. Your DevOps team has adopted GitHub Actions as of today the primary pipeline engine for new pipelines, but you still have a whole bunch of existing pipelines in Azure DevOps. Now the thing is, although Azure DevOps, if you're using YAML pipelines like pipeline as code, GitHub Actions, the GitHub pipeline engine, is also using YAML, pipeline as code language. The downside is that it's not exactly the same YAML. So integrating is doable, migrating is a couple of steps further. But I might actually show you another quick demo how you can streamline the migration from one platform to the other. But first, I'm going to show you how actually you can trigger an Azure DevOps pipeline, an existing one that you have, from GitHub Actions. Inside my GitHub, I got a new project for that. So let me switch to another repo. I called it ADO pipeline run, and inside I do have an action. Let me show you the code first. So what I'm doing here is whenever there is a change, so whenever it's triggering an update in main branch or any other branch, but I only got the main branch here, it's going to run a job called call Azure Pipelines, where it's relying on an existing Azure Pipelines version 1 action out of the marketplace. Next to that, it's going to ask you for real basic Azure DevOps information. What is the project URL? So this is dev.azure.com/your name of your DevOps organization and the name of your Azure DevOps project. Next to that, you need to provide the name of the pipeline that you want to trigger, and it needs to have an Azure DevOps token, where the personal access token from Azure DevOps obviously needs to have enough permissions to run build pipelines. So I'm going to trigger this action from here. I'm going to take a few steps back. Actions, CI update. Let's see what happened here. Update main. Oh yeah, I could actually do it like that. Since we do have it triggered when there's an update in main, I don't have a lot of stuff in my main, but we can still add something. PDT updated this file to trigger an ADO pipeline. Committing the changes. It's gonna trigger an action calling Azure Pipeline, and it's already done. So again, there's not too much on this side, a little bit similar to the issues. So let's validate in Azure DevOps pipelines. What's happening? And as you can see here, my eShop on web GitHub repo CI pipeline just got kicked off. Obviously from here, it's just running like it's been running before. But now it's getting triggered out of GitHub Actions, and we're just reusing the pipelines we already have. Pretty cool stuff, but we're not done yet. There's even more stuff about integration. Maybe I would say actually one of my most favorite topics in the whole presentation so far is using GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. Now there's a little bit of history here where GitHub provides you built-in security for any repositories, public ones and private ones. They're using a mechanism called CodeQL. That's their home-baked, you could say, security code scanning tool, where it provides you a couple of different features. All those features that have been around in GitHub repo security scanning are now available for Azure DevOps as well. They didn't change anything. It's using the same detection patterns, and it's using the same capabilities. For example, secret scanning push protection. This is going to check if code that's getting pushed includes commits and not exposing any secrets. Secret scanning, repo scanning provides you a full end-to-end scanning of your repository and looking again for exposed secrets. Dependency scanning is going to search for known vulnerabilities in your open source dependency packages. And then last, code scanning is using CodeQL static analysis engine, or SAST as we call it, to identify code level application vulnerabilities, like for example, SQL injection or any authentication bypass, or so many different ones. By the way, you might actually look into the ZAP project from OWASP. Although it's actually no longer from OWASP, it's been moved into the Cloud Foundation open source projects. So there's two different scenarios here. The first one is dependency scanning. So in short, what it allows you to do is performing a pipeline-based scanning, just like we already had using any other possible code scanning tool. But now it's reusing the intelligence, the pattern files from GitHub. Next to that, the result itself is aggregated per repo, which means it's going to give you flexibility based on the project as well as the different repositories. And I would say it is recommended, although technically you could actually run it as a separate task, a separate pipeline. But what I would recommend is integrating this dependency scanning task inside the build pipeline that you would use for just building, compiling your application source code. Now, the other option besides the dependency scanning as a standalone one is going through the full, I would say, end-to-end CodeQL scanning solution, where it's a three-step process. Important, you need to provide these 3 steps as part of your pipeline in the correct order. So it starts with advanced security CodeQL init, followed by CodeQL auto build, and then last you're going to trigger the actual analysis. 3 different lines, 3 different tasks, and you need to provide some details. But as you could imagine, I'm going to close this with my last demo. So we're inside our Azure DevOps. My pipeline is still running, pretty cool, but that's not the pipeline I need. So I go into my GitHub Advanced Security pipeline. And what I do here is just running a build pipeline. I have a trigger, I have a pool, I'm specifying some variables, In between here, I would say you typically would have like the build .NET install, .NET NuGet install, .NET build, .NET run, .NET publish, or any other language if it's not .NET. And then from there, you're going to run the different scanning options. So I glue them all four back to back. So I'm running a task for the dependency scanning. And then next, I'm running a task CodeQL init, CodeQL auto build, and CodeQL analyze. The only additional parameter you need to specify here for CodeQL initializing is telling the development language. So it knows which specific pattern files it needs to use. And obviously the language, I have C# because it's a .NET project in my example, but it supports Python, Java, Node applications. That's the thing. Once you run the pipeline, I'm just opening up the already completed one to speed up because it's been running for quite a while. So it starts with the advanced scanning. So what it's going to do here is looking at the different packages or the package libraries, and depending on your language, it's going to pick one or the other. So in my case, it's using NuGet and NuGet packages. Next, we're going to run the security code QL init, where I'm specifying that I want to use it against the C# language. And you can see here, it's loading the extractor, and it's creating what we call the skeleton code QL database, literally importing it, and that's going to be used as the pattern files. The biggest part in the task is a 7-minute task in my sample project where it's performing the actual scanning. So it's running an automatic build C# code. It's going to loop through and it's providing you some details. And then eventually the most important step is the actual CodeQL security scanning. So it's going to run the built-in query pack. So based on the database that we imported in the initialization, it's going to loop through, and if you would validate all the different steps, you can see that it's running CodeQL something something, CodeQL something something, CodeQL something something. Literally looping through all the different CVEs, all the validations, all the code detections, similar as it would run inside GitHub. So if you've been using GitHub security of your repositories, but you also have your Azure DevOps environment, or maybe you still want to run those two environments side by side, it's no longer figuring out which code scanning tool to use if CodeQL is already your standard on the GitHub side. But now we're porting that into Azure DevOps. So with that, I think we're quite done with our presentation here. So as a conclusion, Azure DevOps and GitHub offer powerful integrations that can help you streamlining your workflows and obviously simplifying your development and DevOps processes. By using the tools, the two platforms, bringing in the best of both worlds together, you can effectively collaborate within your team. It's no longer about which tool is better than the other, because in the end, it's a DevOps tool. DevOps is about the culture. It's not about which tools you're using. And I'm a strong believer of bringing those two worlds together. So with that, I would say thank you for watching my session. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned from it. And obviously, we're about halfway through. I hope you're going to enjoy the 44 previous sessions and the 45 sessions coming after this one in the full 90 days of DevOps. Thank you, Michael Kate, for the opportunity. And thank you, my dear community, for supporting this. Without you, there wouldn't even be this event. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see you for next year's 2025 Community Edition.